Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I want to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. Their financial support helps cover the costs associated with hosting and producing the Backyard Ecology podcast and blog. If you would like to join them, you can find more information on the Backyard Ecology website or by searching for Backyard Ecology on the Patreon website. Today we are talking to David Mason. David is a PhD candidate at the University of Florida who has been doing some really interesting work related to songbirds and the seeds they disperse into disturbed areas. I also want to note that about halfway through our conversation, David refers to a plant as ligustrum. Ligustrum is the genus for privet, and I'm so used to switching back and forth between the two names that I didn't realize we temporarily switched to the genus. I know some of you won't notice either, but I also know that some of you aren't as familiar with the scientific names, so I wanted to make sure you knew which plant we were talking about. So let's get started. Hi, David. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yes, I'm really excited about this too, because I first heard about your research probably a couple of months ago now, when I was listening to an episode of the Fire University podcast. And in that episode, your advisor, Dr. Marcus Lashley, made a comment about some surprising results that one of his students was finding with his research. And my initial reaction was, wait a minute. Yeah, because what you were finding was that surprising. And so I am really interested in just learning more about that particular thing and in your research as a whole, because even though we've got this really interesting tidbit of information and finding that you came up with, the rest of your research is really important, has some great implications too. So yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation, I think.
Awesome. I think so as well.
But before we start talking too much about your research itself, why don't we just take a minute or two and let you tell everyone a little bit about who you are and how you got into this field of study.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm from New Jersey, a very developed part of New Jersey. And I honestly, very different from many of the people that I work alongside of. It's not really in my background at all. And I think that's actually one of the reasons I got so into it. And any woods I spent time in were kind of drainage ditches, not particularly nice places. And then when I went away to school, I went to a school in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. And I saw all these people walking around campus doing stuff outside, measuring stuff and standing in the stream and doing all this stuff. And I just wanted to know what it was about. And it was all brand new to me. So I was really excited about it. And I think the puzzle of fitting all these different things together and trying to get answers just was really exciting to me. And I got into a research experience for undergrads internship, and away we went. The rest is history.
Nice. So let's just jump right in. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're studying there at University of Florida?
Yeah, so in general, my dissertation is focused on the ways that resources dictate where seeds arrive, and a resource to an animal, which can be anything that it's using to live and survive and increase its fitness. And because animals are moving around the landscape to find those resources, that's where we can find a lot of animal dispersed seeds, which are the plant species that are really important for wildlife in many cases.
And one of the things that you're really looking at too is prescribed fires, correct?
For sure, yeah. I mean, my work is mostly broken down into two different, we could call them disturbances, although there is a lot of argument about if that word is applicable when it comes to fire and fire adapted systems. But it's fire and then death or carrion, and how these two different disturbances congregate animal behavior and change seed dispersal. They also, tend to make locations favorable for plants to establish. So you kind of got two things going on. The fire or the carrion, they're clearing out some plants. They're making room for new plants. At the same time, they're attracting animals to those locations to disperse seeds. So I think it's probably a really important process to the functioning of ecosystems, and that's why I'm studying it.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, prescribed fire, especially here in the Southeast, is really becoming more and more common. I mean, it was just really starting to, I think, be looked at seriously and used seriously when I was an undergraduate student a couple of decades ago now, but it's really, really becoming much more common and more used now, more
Yep.
so down like in the deeper South than where I'm at in Kentucky. But still, I mean, I'm seeing a great increase in the amount of prescribed fires going. So this is something that's really applicable to a lot of people, homeowners including, or landowners including,
Yep.
because many people do have a few acres or more, which part of that could have prescribed fires on it.
Yeah, that's something that we look at a lot in the lab, and I just gave a webinar to Southern Fire Exchange, kind of talking about this stuff too. Is that it's not just for having a ton of acreage to burn. I mean, that's obviously really important, and that's a way that we can get more acreage burned as well. But we have this whole other subset of private landowners or smaller landowners that can still make use out of burning. But the thing is, we know everything in ecology has some kind of issues with scale. A fire that is the size of a campfire is not the same effect as a fire that's the size of a football field even. So we don't really know how these different effects scale up, but we want to try to look at that and try to show that or explore whether there are benefits to burning at a small scale. And we find that a lot of the same effects we see with smaller fire as well, the beneficial effects.
Right. And I mean, of course, when we talk about even beneficial effects, beneficial to what? I mean,
Yeah.
we've got I mean, if you've got a small quarter-acre remnant prairie that's got all the prairie species plant-wise, then yes, it needs fire to really benefit those species. But does it have the same effect or benefit all the animals that might be located there, or other factors that a larger fire on another area might? I mean,
yeah, no, I mean, you're dead right with that. It's always contextual, and that's kind of what makes us sort of frustrating to talk to sometimes, is because it's tough for us to give straight answers on things. Because you're right, it depends. And throwing around a word like benefit, yeah, that's a black and white word, and that's not the way nature is.
right. And I do it all the time too. I'm as guilty as the next person of doing it. But it is something to keep in mind too, when we can remember to do so.
Yes. What your goals are. That's it. You should always
Yes.
ask, what are your goals before you answer the question? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So a lot of your work is looking at birds specifically, correct?
Yep.
As being the carrier to bring in the different seeds.
Yeah, I mean, birds are really important dispersers. They're not the only dispersers. We know a lot of mammals disperse seeds, even carnivorous mammals, even something like deer disperse a ton of seeds, not even just fleshy fruit producing species, but deer can consume all kinds of seeds from plants, while they're in the process of consumption, the foliage. They can consume seeds and disperse them. I mean, there's papers coming out all the time that are like, oh, we looked at the scat of this particular herbivore or this particular ungulate and found that we could germinate 20 seeds out of it or whatever. And they're not seeds that produce fleshy fruit. So there's a lot of seed dispersal going on. I am focused a lot on birds for the reason I said before, that they're really important seed dispersers in our system, but also I have a mechanism that I've developed that I can measure it, and it's a lot harder to try to congregate and collect scat. You can do it, but this system that I'm using a lot in my work with these perches and stuff, birds are really amenable to it. They love my perches, even when there's other perches around. They seem to like to aggregate themselves on them, which gives me a great way to pay attention to them with a camera. So I got a camera on the perch and I can watch which birds are coming in, and then they defecate and I can go there and collect the seed. So I kind of can get it all in one place, which is good for measurement.
Yes, yes, exactly. So I just realized we haven't really described kind of your setup and location for where you're doing your research. Let's for right now look at the fire related.
Sure. Yeah.
Research. But yeah, we might want to step back and do that real quick.
Yeah, I have my dissertation research is in 4 different states, but I have other stuff going on too. So I forget sometimes to be making sure I lay the setting, the set and setting.
Mhm.
But the fire research occurs at Tall Timbers Research Station, which is outside of Tallahassee, in the Red Hills region. And then I have that's paired with some work at Escambia National Forest, which is National Experimental Forest, which is right over the border into Alabama, but farther down the Panhandle, so probably about 3 hours away from Tall Timbers or something. So that's where the bulk of the fire research is occurring, at those 2 locations.
And so describe kind of the setting. When are the fires done? What
Yeah,
it's Florida, I'm going to say pines.
yeah, yeah. They're a lot of longleaf pine savanna, but there's other species intermingled in there as well, different pine species, and with different histories of the site. So Tall Timbers has a lot of like old fields that are, sort of being reconverted or back into a more natural setting. And then Escambia is really focused on longleaf pine regeneration, like growing longleaf pines. So that is pretty dense longleaf pine forest, and it's got different goals. They're trying to grow, trying to grow as many longleaf pines as close together as they can. Because their goal is looking at timber production and stuff. Where at Tall Timbers, they are trying to create habitat for quail, but everything that goes along with that as well. So that's a much more open savanna type area. And I'm at Tall Timbers, I'm using their management and setting up my experiment within that. So that whole property is cut up into these little parcels, and it's like a checkerboard for which one gets burned in a given year. And they alternate every year. So every single parcel is burned every 2 years, and you get this alternating pattern. So I go and pick two parcels that are close together, that are, one was burning this year, one wasn't burning this year, and I set up traps on either side of them. And that way I can make these pairs and control for whatever variation we may see across the landscape. On top of that, though, we are also burning other plots in different seasons. And these are smaller plots, and this is an experiment that is sort of separate from the rest of their management. And that is the one that's occurring in Alabama and at Tall Timbers. And we just have, these 4 smaller plots, and we're burning them in each different season, and they each have a seed trap in them.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I was wondering about, was the timing and how that could potentially affect things.
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't mention that at Tall Timbers, they're burning early in the growing season mostly. So they're mostly burning in March. But these others, you can imagine, we know that plants have different, timing that they fruit and that they flower. And if, my hypothesis is that, fire is, generating resources that attract the seed disperser, then clearly it's going to matter when that fire occurs, which plants can end up there. And, we're exploring that as a potential management technique, even to try to, among all the other concerns that managers have, that, depending on when you burn, could affect which seeds arrive and naturally regenerate in your plots.
Right. Which, I mean, that is something to consider. I mean, it's not going to say, oh, we don't want to do it this time, because with fire, sometimes it's, yeah, this would be the perfect time, but the conditions are right now, because you really have to also not just look at the ecological things that you want to accomplish, but we've also got to pay attention to a little bit of safety here too.
Yeah, no, my brain, I don't have as much of the practical brain in me, and as much practical experience with trying to get burn permits and stuff. But you're totally right. I mean, the number one concern is safety, and then getting fire on the ground whenever you can get it on the ground. But I'm kind of jumping ahead 10 steps and thinking, well, if you could really dictate exactly when, then you could. But I deal with that too, because my scheduling is always up in the air, because it depends on the weather, when we're going to do stuff. So we can't control the weather, and you never know when the right conditions are going to be arising. You're dead on with that.
Yes, and my brain works more like your brain. My husband's brain is the one that's going to go more that, but we've got to get in. And I was like, okay, yeah, you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think, hey, we need all different types.
Exactly.
For us to do it together. Yep.
Yes. So, okay. So we've got these burn areas.
Yep.
And we've got these, what you're calling the traps, the seed traps set out, which are basically, you've got a screen
Mm-hmm.
that's set up horizontally so that things can get caught in it, with
Yes.
some perches above it that birds can come in and fly in and perch on. And
Yep.
then birds, when they fly off of a perch,
Yep.
whether it's a tree or a branch or your house or telephone wire, or in this case, your perches,
Yep.
they tend to defecate, make themselves lighter before they fly off.
Exactly. Yep.
So anything that goes in must come out. And therefore, you've got potentially, since you're catching the defecation, you can then pick through it and find out what they've been eating.
Exactly. And, that's a good point, because I don't just catch seeds. I catch anything that falls out of the sky or falls out of the bird. And, actually, I think these traps have a little bit of other utility in that I could probably look at the diet of birds in general using it, because I find all sorts of insect parts, and you can see them on the camera, the way they'll take some insect, bash it against the trap, and then they'll consume a part of it sometimes the whole thing. But when they consume a part of it, the rest of it ends up in the trap too. So you get like, little legs of things and stuff all in there as well, or nesting materials. They'll bring nesting materials there on their way somewhere else, and that'll fall off. And then in that scat, sometimes I'm digging through it, depending on how fresh it is. Sometimes the rain comes, and this is a particularly nice situation for me, because the rain will come and wash all of it away, and there will just be, it couldn't be any more perfect. Sometimes it's just seeds sitting there on the trap, and I'm happy when I see that, for sure.
Yes, that would be much nicer.
Yeah. I don't want to find out, what kind of stuff is living inside the sky. I do wear gloves, but, safety first.
Yes. So what kind of birds are you seeing visiting these areas?
We get all kinds of birds at Tall Timbers, migrants and residential birds. I think I'm up around 35, and that's not even through the first year of all the data. It's a 2-year experiment. So if I had to guess, I think we're going to end up maybe slightly over 40 bird species visiting the traps. And we'll get things that are not songbirds, that we're not particularly looking for, but are cool to see. Even like a vulture will land on the trap. I tried to scale the trap in certain ways, but even though it's what I would think is too small for them, you'll get red-tailed hawk standing on it, wobbling back and forth like that. Like, why do you want to be on there? But vultures on there. But then, of course, a lot of songbirds. We'll get something like, of course, cardinals, and mockingbirds will be on there. We'll get different corvids like jays and crows, some red-winged blackbirds, things like indigo bunting, tanagers, grosbeak, really just a big spread of a lot of different birds. And Tall Timbers is particularly rich. When I run these experiments in other places for different questions, but using that same setup, sometimes I will only get a bird species or two, depending on the time of year and what that site is like. Tall Timbers is really fertile, and they have this big open canopy with tons of vegetation because of their management style. So there is a ton of birds in a place like that.
Yes, these grassland areas, shrubland areas, open woods, savanna type habitats. Oh my gosh, there are so many different bird species that you can find there. It is just amazing.
It's so beautiful. I mean, I had never seen anything like that until I got there. And we don't have anything like that in New Jersey per se. I mean, we do have nice hardwood forests, but it's not as quite as open.
Mm-hmm.
And just reading about it, I got my master's in Mississippi State. I was doing some plant ecology stuff there with nothing to do with animals. That's kind of what got me into animals, is realizing how little I could explain just looking at soil and sunlight and stuff. I realized there's this other component that I really wanted to get at that is super important. But I read a lot of the publications out of Tall Timbers. They have these really nice sort of natural history things that were written in the 60s and 70s, published as part of their conference proceedings and stuff. And I fell in love with the way that they were describing the Lonely Pine system and what it looked like, and how lightning operated in it with the fire. I have no idea that I would end up doing work there someday, but it's been a dream come true. I mean, it's truly a beautiful system. I don't know, maybe I'm partial to it, but it's something for sure.
Oh yes, exactly. Yeah, I've always kind of been drawn to those open areas too, and the kind of savanna, oak savanna more than pine savanna.
Yeah.
And those sorts of areas. I mean, I like my closed canopy forest as well.
Yeah.
but I really like the open air, the semi-open to open areas as well.
Yeah, I think there's some, I don't know how concrete this is, but there is some thinking that, it's some kind of evolutionary trait in humans, some kind of preference for certain types of areas for what that may mean for productivity or predators or
Mm-hmm.
the presence of game. I don't know, but yeah, I think
Yeah.
maybe it's a little bit hardwired in us. So
Yeah, I've seen a lot about that too in several different places as well. So let's tell everybody a little bit about what types of seeds you are finding in these areas, both at Tall Timbers and then maybe at some of those other sites that you were mentioning.
yeah, at Tall Timbers, I ended up kind of selecting what I will call focal species, and I didn't really know what they would be until I saw what got in the trap. But there are fruiting species like rubus species, blackberries, beautyberry, pokeweed, and sumacs. Those are probably the big bird dispersed seeds that I'm finding a lot. And of course, I'm getting a ton of grasses. I mean, like I said before, it's an open. So I catch wind dispersed species as well. So a lot of grasses that are flying around and different sunflower species that have wind adaptations. They're flying around and landing in my trap as well. But those bird dispersed species are the ones I catch the most of. I mean, I can, depending on the timing when I arrive at the trap, and, the season of fruiting that's happening, I could, I think I've hit like 800, 900 seeds,
Wow.
and that's over the course of maybe 20 some days, and it's a meter square. Now I am concentrating their activity with a perch, so you can't just extrapolate that for every meter square, but it's certainly it's a lot of seeds.
And what about the other sites?
Sure. So, at Escambia, the longleaf place, we're catching a lot of longleaf seeds. And that's because, that canopy is closed. There's not as much stuff in the understory, which means there's not as many bird species to disperse it in the first place. That place is really dominated by gallberry, and it's like a super dominant in the understory. And I don't know if that has to do with the timing of the fire or the light availability in that area. Maybe it's like one of the only ones that is going to persist in that sort of restricted environment. But I'm pretty much getting a lot of those two for sure. Now, some of the preliminary experiments that we've done with feeders in Alabama, for example, that place we caught a lot of Ilex vomitoria yalpin, and that was a site that had yalpin and as well as ligustrum, which we didn't catch ligustrum, but we caught the yalpin.
That's really interesting and important because a lot of those, I mean, what you're talking about, I mean, beautyberry, pokeberry, your blackberries, the yupon, those are all native species.
Yep.
So it's really interesting and exciting to know that if you have these disturbance factors, if you open up the ground and the vegetation,
Yep.
if you've got these plants in the area, the birds are going to help disperse those seeds and bring those into the newly disturbed soils and the newly disturbed areas.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that happens with seed dispersal, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, but most seeds don't make it very far away from the parent plant. You sort of have this hump shape where it's kind of a decaying shape where most of the seeds are close to the parent plant and very few make it far away. And what we're seeing when we visit these burned areas is that the burn kind of removes most of the above ground biomass, at least in terms of leaves and fruit. Not always, not all of it, but in general, there's not as much fruit in that location. So you wouldn't expect a lot of fruit to land there because it's not really there on the landscape unless you had this vector like a bird that can take it from somewhere else, from off site, off the burn, and bring it to that burn, which is indeed what we're seeing happening. It's a big part of the regeneration process.
I'm really excited about that, being able to bring it in, but that's not that thing that made me go, wait, what? Because I would expect if you've got native plants around, they would be brought in. But most of us also have invasive species around that we're having to deal with. And we know that birds eat berries from invasive species. So we'd kind of assume that they would be spreading them as well, just like we know they eat native seeds. So we would expect them to be spreading those. But that's not what you're finding.
Yeah, at least in this preliminary research that we did in Alabama, where we had sort of two predominant species, again, the privet and the yalpin, We didn't catch the privet, but we did catch the yaupon exclusively. And that is interesting because, there's a lot of documentation of birds dispersing invasives, or at least consuming invasives, as you said. And there's a lot of work about preferences between invasives and native species. And in this case, we didn't see it. Now, why that is the case is a very interesting question. I think that so I've seen some meta-analyses, some kind of reviews trying to collect, because you got a lot of different people set up the experiments in different ways. They find contrasting things, sort of confusing to wade your way through that. Like, what is the answer? Do birds prefer native or non-native seeds, and what is going on there? And it seems that, if the invasive species is very similar to the native species, that if it is producing more fruit, or it's presenting fruit in an easier to get way, or it's more nutritious or more attractive in any way, then in that case you can get some of the introduced species being dispersed more, or some of the invasives being dispersed more than the native species. Now, in this case, we have the yaupon, which is a red berry, and the privet, which is sort of a bluish, pallid purple kind of looking thing. They are presented on the plant differently. And of course, there are different colors. They are roughly the same size, which is important for gape width, how much the bird can fit into its mouth. I'm not sure if those differences were one of the reasons, or if it's a nutritional difference between the two species, or if it really is maybe the dispersers that happen to be in that area, and just that those particular birds, which in that case was a lot of cardinals, whether they were driving that difference. And maybe if there was a different bird species, we would see something different. I'm not sure. There's a lot of different possibilities, but it is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting that that's happening. And yeah, like you said, there's a lot of different things that can affect bird preferences. And that's one of the ones that really comes to my mind as a possibility too. I mean, I know there was an article I read a year or two ago. So some of the details have gone a little fuzzy at this point.
Understandable.
But yeah, it was in I believe it was in the kind of greater metro DC area. And they'd been doing a lot of fall bird banding during the migration. And so they kind of added this extra study on for a couple of years, looking at what the birds were eating. So they'd get the birds after they caught them, banded them, weighed them, did all the normal bird banding stuff, and getting all those normal metrics on the health and everything of the birds. They'd cause the birds to regurgitate.
Yeah.
And then look and see what they were eating. And there was a definite preference for the native berries, as long as those native fruits were around. Now, after the native fruits were gone, then they started seeing more of the non-natives as well. So it's like, okay, could just timing have played a role in that? And then, like you said, the species of birds, different birds are going to eat different things.
Yeah, and that timing of the fruiting is really, really interesting as well, and just the timing associated with the plant in general, foliage and things like that as well. Just all the phenological traits. Those can be important components of what makes a species invasive, in general. And of course, there's a list of traits like that. But I'm thinking a little bit about Lonicera, honeysuckle, and that's a fruit that is widely consumed, and I've seen evidence that it's actually can contribute to the dispersal of native species by congregating birds in the area. They also will happen to feed on the natives and increase dispersal that way. But there's some interesting things going on with the timing of fruit with those plants as well. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really interesting. I thought was just the whole idea that, okay, there are these places where it's not a lack of access to invasive species, but we're still not seeing them. And that just makes me go, huh? What? Why? And there's no real way to answer the why at this point, at least. But it makes you start thinking, because what goes in must come out. So if it's going in, why aren't we seeing it come out?
Yeah, it's probably, it's going to take studies in different systems, and collection of those studies to make a broader inference, because as we said, kind of at the top, it's going to be contextual, and it's going to be tough to find the general principles when the actual mechanisms may be different depending on the system. As for the ligustrum, I just don't know. I found it quite strange too. It's what I expected to catch in the seed traps. They were right there. They're right in the area. I could see them from the seed trap, but not catching them. So I don't know. I wish I had, monitored. I wish I had sat there for 3 weeks with binoculars and watched and saw what was going on, but it was not the case.
That's something another student can do.
Yes,
See,
for
they
sure.
just build on your work. That's the way science works. We build on each other's work.
Yep. Maybe I'll go back there someday. I mean, that experiment, we were really trying to look at how resources attract birds and how that affects seed dispersal. As a part of that, we're also looking at whether or not invasive species are dispersed towards the resources. But really, we had a totally different question in mind, which was, bird feeding is a multi-million-dollar industry, and it's ubiquitous in some parts of the world, at least. I know that it's really popular in Europe and America, at least. I'm not so sure about other parts of the world, but it's it's everywhere. People are feeding supplemental feeding on birds, but most of the time people are putting those feeders in a residential area where the plant is not going to be able to establish. So in some ways they could be, depending on where they're positioned, they could be attracting native seeds to an area where they're going to perish, whether they're going to get mowed over or treated with some kind of herbicide or whatever, or just onto a pavement. Even some feeders are just sitting above pavement or a deck. And I thought this was just another interesting way that people interact with the environment in a way that we don't think about it, that sort of creating a trap for plants.
Yeah, I never really thought about it like that. But I always think of the birds taking stuff out, but I never really thought about birds bringing native seeds in to these bird feeding areas.
Right. Yeah. And that's, it gets, every time I start to describe this experiment, it gets a little confusing because I keep saying, seeds, and there's seeds inside the feeder and there's seeds from away from the feeder. And which one am I talking about? But yeah, you got it right. There's, what we'll call food resource, but there's also seeds from the surrounding landscape. And so, if you're attracting seeds from the surrounding landscape, there's a lot you could do with that. There's a lot of work, looking at trying to, monitor or catch invasive species using that as a method, using a perch as a method. So maybe, this is, a pathway to sort of improve that by adding another resource to it, something I've been thinking about working on. Whether you're going to try to, if you could do it at a big enough scale or protect a small enough area, maybe you could catch a lot of seeds as they're coming in. And, if they're seeds you don't want because they're an invasive in your neck of the woods, in your system, you'd have them right there. You've stopped them before they've entered the next stage. So you could remove them if you wanted to. But you could also just sort of document, what is going on in your system as well. Which plants are there. Basically, you can look at which plants are there without going out and counting them.
Yeah.
A lot of useful
ways. And I'm even spinning it the other way in my brain as we're talking about this. I mean, there's so much interest anymore in creating pocket prairies or native habitat at home, little areas, and turning your yard, planting more native plants and stuff. What about putting perches out and just letting the birds bring in those native seeds? So you've got these perches, you're attracting the birds to the area. Well, let's make use of what they're bringing in.
Yeah, and you're hijacking this general mechanism that I'm trying to look at and think about with this dissertation work. This resources dictating where seeds go. You're hijacking that method to accomplish a goal, which is useful and really cool. I mean, that's a lot of people that participated. This stuff about the bird feeders and the yards. That was a poster for TWS. That was my first poster. And a lot of people, once they realized what I was talking about, they were like, wait a minute, we don't want to do that. We're trying to be helpful to nature, right? I didn't know I was potentially hurting the plants. And that got us thinking, well, I guess it really would depend where you position it, huh? Like
Mhm.
you got a yard, let's say half of it's, yard, half of it's, underneath some trees, maybe some plants could colonize there. Depending on what's arriving, you could position it in different places to accomplish different goals.
Mhm.
And that
Mhm.
does that scale up for larger management? I'm not sure. There's practical considerations there, but I think at a small scale, like you're saying, I don't see any reason why not.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be an interesting project to do. I mean, it'd be fun just to do
Yeah.
as a homeowner, as a landowner. But I could also seeing it be potentially some interesting research looking into that urban ecology and those more urban areas or suburban built landscaped areas.
Yeah, for sure.
Just lots of questions and thoughts here.
Yeah, and that's what we do here all day. Too many for us to even get to all of them, but we have so much fun coming up with strange questions. So
Yes. So you had also mentioned that you're doing some research with mortality events
yeah,
and how that changes things. So explain that a little bit because I'm just curious at this
yeah.
point on that.
Well, this kind of gets into how I'm trying to think as broadly about this stuff as possible. I'm trying to get at general processes. And for me, when I think about it like that, fire or a cadaver are similar things. And I know, in some ways maybe there's many differences we could talk about between the two, but I think that they both can represent a resource. And a much different type of resource. One is highly localized, one is biotic. It's an actual animal. So I have these different experiments set up with carrion and looking at seeds that arrive at carrion, looking at what happens to seeds inside of carrion when they perish. Because all animals will perish unless it's like a Medusa jellyfish or something. All animals are going to perish at a time. So that's maybe not a super common occurrence for any individual seed, but when you aggregate all the times that an animal dies throughout evolutionary history, it's probably an important process as well.
Yeah, and I've never really thought about, okay,
Yeah.
I think about, okay, it's dead. Now it's food for everything that eats dead things, and it's
Hmm.
going to decompose and that process. But I never think about what happens to what's in the guts
Yeah. Or
of
what's
it.
on the outside of it.
Yeah, exactly. Or what's on the outside. Because, I mean, if it's a mammal, it's got fur,
Hmm.
and anybody in the Southeast knows cockleburrs and stick
Yep.
tights. And
Yeah. So I'm looking at all these different ways that seeds can benefit from being dispersed by animals. And you know, if you the more opportunities you have for it to be what we'll call a good dispersal event, like what ends up with you being able to colonize, it doesn't matter which one happens, whether you get directed to a fire, whether you get directed to a dead animal, whether you're inside the dead animal. You take all those opportunities together, and it's probably it increases the probability of that relationship ending up with something positive for the plant, and which makes sense that we would see it so commonly occur. It's many plants are dispersed by animals.
Mhm.
Yeah, that research with the carrion, it also we are looking at individual carrion, but we're also looking at large scale die-offs as well, and that gets us into I'm talking about resources attracting animals, but those resources can be more or less. They can be smaller and bigger. There can be more of them, less of them. They can be distributed differently around the landscape or all together. And these are all sort of the nitty gritty things that we try to parse out as best we can.
So, with the seed dispersal and the carrion research, are you primarily looking at the carrion and its seed dispersal, or are you looking at other things that might be coming into the carrion and how they're dispersing the seeds?
Both, they're two separate experiments, but both those pathways are being explored. And we have the carrion decomposing itself,
Mm-hmm.
and that is a dramatic localized effect. If you've ever seen it, it sort of looks like like a chalk outline when somebody. It looks like that sort of. It's like a footprint of the animal itself where it last laid, and it decomposes. It kills all the plants right there, so you get this bare patch, and it sort of extends a little bit outside of the animal. But those nutrients are toxic at first. And that's why it kills all those plants. That and it's laying on top of them, so they're not getting sun, right? It's both of those things together. But those nutrient levels wane, and once they do, it becomes highly fertile. So then you see this lush green vegetation all around that circle or that footprint, and then it sort of slowly colonizes in. And you can see that, from 100 yards away. Sometimes you could point it out, like, oh, there's a carrion there. You know, it kind of looks like if you ever had a dog that maybe you didn't clean up after it enough in the backyard, and you'll see, like, I see the little patches of the ground where it's like that a little bit. So we're taking seeds. I made these little pouches out of screening again. I'm using screening quite a bit in this dissertation work. And I took a bunch of different seeds from different types of seeds, how long they stay dormant and whether they're dormant or not. I put them in these pouches, then I put them underneath the decomposing pig and on top of the decomposing pig. And the idea here is, how does the pig affect seeds that are coming in, landing there? And how does it affect seeds that are already there in the seed bank, which is a whole other can of worms that we haven't really touched on yet here. Yeah. But I want to know, how does carrion affect seeds? Because I couldn't find any information on it. And it turns out it can kill seeds. It's a really moist environment. So you get they rot, and, it attracts a bunch of things that can, eat the seeds and kill the seeds as well. But it depends on how hard the seed is. So some seeds that are physically dormant, we call them, some things like a lot of the bean species, like a nice hard seed, those can persist. But many of the other ones, they don't survive it. So I had to go back after 2 weeks, lift up the decomposing pig and try to retrieve this, right? And then get all of the putrefied, I think it's a technical word, putrefied biomass out of that pouch, and take the seeds and then try to germinate them. And the carrion is definitely a filter for seed survival. It determines what can survive there. So it's definitely going to affect what plants you see afterwards.
Oh my gosh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was something.
On so many different levels. Although I will have to say, I would rather dig through the bird poop on the screen than to lift up the carrion. And 2 weeks, especially 2 weeks old, and I'm thinking, I just can't help but imagine July, August timeframe, and that would be bad enough here in Kentucky. I don't even want to imagine Florida.
It gets. I don't want to get too details with the grossness, but it gets more difficult, I would say, to lift them up as the time goes on. They lose their structure. So that was an interesting experiment, but it has practical relevance. I mean, again, because we're talking about all those animals. Every animal is going to die, but also a lot of invasive species, they are eradicated in some cases and disposed of. And it's a big question for managers on how to dispose of them, as different people have kind of started developing different techniques with no real research to tell them how to do it. Just kind of depending on what they do on their property when they have all of these pigs. And we use that opportunity to study this thing that we think is a general process, because obviously getting vertebrate carrion, you can't really get it because no one's going to, kill an animal for this. It's not how we do things. But when it comes to, wild pigs, they are, eradicated by certain agencies and stuff. So there are some carrion available to study this process.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point to point out here, is that the wild hogs that you're working with, those are an invasive species. I mean, a lot of times when we're talking invasive species, we're always thinking plants or insects, but there are other types of invasive species, and feral hogs can cause huge amounts of habitat damage and ecological damage where they're at.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we see that, that they are extremely destructive to ecosystems. They knock down the species richness, even just, once they show up somewhere, you get a big decline in the species. And they also have a ton of economic impact as well. Mm-hmm. So, trying to deal with them in, all these different ways that they need to be dealt with, but even after you deal with them, then, where do you, how do you dispose of them is a question that, needs to be answered. And, I'm in some small way, while I'm looking at this general process I keep referring to about resources, I'm exploring some of that as well.
Right. Yeah, because when you first started talking about that research, because I hadn't run into it really yet, but when you first started talking about it a few minutes ago, I was picturing natural deaths in the wild or roadkill. I mean,
Mhm.
because I don't have where I'm at, we don't have feral hogs yet. But yeah, I wasn't even thinking about wild hogs until you brought that up. And then now thinking about wild hogs and some of the eradication methods and what they do, yeah, that's a huge piece of the puzzle that could be really, really important to think about.
Yeah, because it's going to have an impact on the ecosystem, no matter what you decide to do with them, and the water table and diseases, and there's a million questions that come out of it. So yeah, it's a challenge for sure in a lot of our ecosystems, and a lot of different regions of the United States. It's a pressing issue.
Yes,
Not the
yes.
focus of my research, but it's a way that some of my research can help managers make decisions, I would say.
Yeah, it's another thing to be considered. I mean, like we were saying earlier with the fire research and the invasive plant species, there's a million different questions and things to look at. And there's the perfect world, and then there's reality. And we have to kind of find that balance. But I love research like this that, yes, it's answering a really interesting question or bringing up additional interesting questions. But then there's real life applications too
Yeah.
with it,
Yeah.
and finding that balance between, okay, we're just pursuing knowledge for the sake of knowledge because that's really fun to do, but then how can we take that knowledge and apply it and use it in our own lives and worlds?
Yep. And that is, I think, one of the main goals of our lab is just that. I mean, we focus on disturbance from a management perspective many times, and with fire, and we focus on game species and things that are very practically important to people around the country, and especially in our region. But we are always also trying to reach for some ecological theory that we think advances the discipline, and that is the balance we sort of straddle in everything we do.
Yes. Well, this has been really interesting. I've learned a lot and started thinking about things a little bit differently and some things. I've got lots of questions and stuff going on in my mind right now.
Cool.
But yeah, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. If people want to ask questions or learn more, can they contact you?
Sure. And we get contacted by people all the time. We have a Deer Lab Facebook. That's the lab I'm in, the UF Deer Lab. We have a Facebook that people can reach out on. I have a personal email which we can add to the show notes, and
Yes.
you can find me on Instagram or Twitter at ecograffito, which we can also put in the
Yes. I will have all those links and stuff in the show notes so that people can do it. And also, well, I'll put links to the Deer Lab and stuff. And I think we should real quick here mention that Deer Lab is not just about white-tailed deer.
Yeah, it's a way for us to try to do this straddling, like I just said, is that we do a lot of stuff with deer. Deer are really important herbivores, and they're culturally important as well. But we use that acronym. DEER is an acronym for disturbance, ecology, and ecological restoration. So I'm talking about both things at once again.
Yes, again, yes. Exactly. I love that. But yeah, I wanted to bring that out and point that out because when I first started hearing about the Deer Lab, I was like, white-tailed deer lab. And then when I went to the page and saw what it was, like, oh, that's cool. I like
Nice.
that.
Yes.
But yeah, so again, I will have everything in the show notes for people that want to learn more and stuff. And thank you again so much, David, for talking with us today. Have a great day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye. I appreciate David taking the time to talk with us today. His research on seed dispersal is very interesting. I hadn't really thought about some of the things he's studying, or at least hadn't thought of them in those ways. And his work brings up lots of questions in my mind. The fact that he didn't find any seeds from invasive plants in his traps is one of those things that after you get past the, wait a minute, what stage, it makes you just scratch your head and go, This finding isn't to say that birds don't spread invasive species, but it does suggest that other factors besides just the availability of the fruits are at play. And that just makes us want to learn more and to better understand all of the different dynamics involved. Also, because I tend to think of things from an animal perspective first, I really never thought about what happens to the seeds of native plants when birds come to feeders in our built environments. David is right, though, when he said that those seeds are typically lost to the system because they either land where they can't germinate or they're removed as weeds. It's not something that I'm overly concerned about in most cases, because even in wilder areas, not every seed is going to land in a favorable place for it to germinate and grow. But it does make me think about ways we may be able to potentially use that to our advantage. Like David, I'm not sure how scalable putting perches out might be for larger restoration efforts, but I definitely see the glimmer of possibilities for smaller settings, such as in our pollinator gardens or in similar plantings around our homes or in our communities. Then there's that whole other side of his work, looking at seed dispersal related to carrion. Now, we weren't originally planning to go there with this conversation, and I almost cut it out of the episode, but it is such an intriguing question. I've never thought about how an animal's death, whether that death is from natural causes, getting hit by a car, or management activities such as the removal of feral hogs, might play a role in seed dispersal or influence the vegetation in an area. I'm guessing that I'm not alone in never having thought about that. In the end, that's a big part of why I decided to leave it in, because sometimes it's good to think about, or at least be aware of, connections that you never thought of before. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know about my email list. Every week I send a short email with links to the most recent Backyard Ecology blog article and podcast episode, as well as any other news of interest. It's the best way to make sure that you never miss anything in the Backyard Ecology world. If you haven't signed up, then I encourage you to do so at www.backyardecology.net/subscribe. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.